March 24, 1945. The skies above Berlin. Oberleutnant Klaus Fischer pulled his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into a climbing turn, his gloved hand steady on the control column despite the G-forces compressing his chest. Through the armored glass of his canopy, he spotted them a formation of American B-17 flying fortresses, droning northward at 25,000 feet, their vapor trails scratching white lines across the clear morning sky. And there, weaving above and around the bombers like protective birds, were the escort fighters. Even from 3 kilometers away, Fischer could identify them by their distinctive markings. The tails were painted bright red, crimson as fresh blood against the aluminum fuselage. Fischer's lips curled into something between a sneer and a smile. He keyed his radio microphone. Achtung, Kameraden! The Schwarzflieger are here, the Red Tails. In his headset, he heard the laughter of his fellow pilots, a sound that mingled confidence with contempt. One voice crackled through. The Americans send their servants to die in the place of their real soldiers. How generous. Fischer checked his ammunition counter. 150 rounds of 20mm cannon shells, 600 rounds of 7.9, 2mm machine gun ammunition, and pushed his throttle forward. He had shot down 23 Allied aircraft in his career. He expected these Americans, these black Americans whom the Luftwaffe pilots had heard, were poorly trained and equipped with inferior machines, to be easy additions to his tally. What Fischer didn't know, as he dove toward what he assumed would be an easy kill, was that he was about to encounter the most devastating fighter group in the entire Mediterranean theater. He didn't know that the very aircraft he dismissed as flown by servants had been protecting bomber formations with a success rate that defied every statistical model in the Army Air Forces. He didn't know that the men in those distinctive aircraft had been forged in a crucible of discrimination so intense that by the time they reached the European sky, they possessed a level of determination, skill, and unit cohesion that made them nearly invincible. This wasn't just a story about aerial combat. This was the arrival of mathematical certainty, of training so rigorous and motivation so absolute that it transformed prejudice into fuel and mockery into determination. The German pilots who encountered the Tuskegee Airmen, the 332nd Fighter Group, known universally as the Red Tails, were about to learn a lesson written in tracer fire and confirmed by wreckage. That excellence knows no color, and that underestimating your enemy based on the pigmentation of their skin is a fatal miscalculation that gets carved into loss reports and written in the logbooks of the defeated. The mathematics of this confrontation were established long before Fischer pulled his control column, long before the first Red Tail ever painted his distinctive markings. In a place that seemed about as far from aerial combat as one could imagine, Tuskegee, Alabama, on July 19, 1941, a 90-degree summer day with humidity thick enough to drink, 13 black men stood at attention on a dirt airfield, while a white flight instructor walked past them with an expression of barely concealed hostility. These were the first cadets of the Tuskegee experiment, a program created by the Army Air Corps under pressure from civil rights organizations and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, but designed according to the whispered assumptions of its architects to fail. The prevailing wisdom, codified in official reports and repeated in officers' clubs across the nation, held that black men lacked the intelligence, the reflexes, and the temperament to fly complex military aircraft. The Tuskegee program existed not to prove this wrong, but to document the inevitable failure scientifically, to put numbers to prejudice and close the question forever. Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., one of those initial cadets and the son of the Army's first black general, would later recall that first day with crystalline clarity. "They wanted us to fail," he wrote in his memoir. "Every regulation was interpreted in the strictest possible manner. Every standard was applied with maximum rigor. The washout rate for white cadets at other flying schools hovered around 40%. They were determined to achieve 100% with us. But the architects of failure had made a critical miscalculation. They had created a filter so fine, a selection process so punishing, that only the absolute best could survive. While white cadets at other bases could succeed with merely good reflexes and adequate determination, the Tuskegee cadets needed to be exceptional in every metric just to remain in the program. The result wasn't failure. The result was the opposite, a concentration of talent so dense that it bordered on the unprecedented. Consider the training regimen. At standard Army Air Forces flying schools, cadets received approximately 200 hours of flight training before receiving their wings. At Tuskegee, the average was 320 hours, with an additional 180 hours of ground school that covered everything from advanced meteorology to aircraft engineering. While other schools might overlook a rough landing or imperfect formation flying, Tuskegee instructors would wash out cadets for infractions that would earn only warnings elsewhere. Charles DeBow, one of the original Tuskegee cadets, recorded in his diary on October 3, 1941. Today, Jenkins was eliminated from the program because his rate of climb was 15 feet per minute too slow on 3 consecutive training flights. 15 feet per minute. The margin between staying in this program and going home is measured in seconds and inches. We are being forged into something harder than the men who will judge us. The numbers told a story of artificial constraint producing superhuman output. Between 1941 and 1946, the Tuskegee program graduated 996 pilots from approximately 14,000 applicants, a selection rate of 7%, compared to 15% at other Army Air Forces schools. These men weren't simply good pilots who happened to be black. They were the survivors of a Darwinian filter designed to eliminate them. Men who had overcome institutional resistance so enormous that the very act of earning their wings represented a level of dedication that their future enemies would fatally underestimate. When the first Tuskegee graduates, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, shipped out to North Africa in April 1943, they carried with them 320 hours of flight training per pilot, a squadron average that exceeded the total flying hours of many entire Luftwaffe Gruppen at that stage of the war. But hours in the air were only one variable in the equation. The other was motivation, and here the Tuskegee Airmen possessed an advantage that defied quantification. When a white pilot from Iowa or Texas climbed into his cockpit, he carried with him the normal motivations of combat: patriotism, survival, camaraderie, the desire to complete his tour and go home. When a red tail pilot strapped into his P-51 Mustang, he carried something additional: the weight of an entire race's aspirations, the burden of proving wrong every bigot who had sworn he couldn't do it, and the knowledge that a single mistake would be attributed not to his individual failing, but to the supposed inadequacy of his entire people. First Lieutenant Lee Archer, who would eventually become one of the top red tail aces, explained it in an interview recorded in 1988. Every mission wasn't just about hitting the target or protecting the bombers. Every mission was a referendum on whether black men deserved to be treated as equals. We couldn't just be good. We had to be perfect. And so we were. The strategic situation into which these perfectly trained, hyper-motivated pilots were inserted made their impact inevitable. By early 1944, the Allied bombing campaign over Europe was hemorrhaging aircraft at an unsustainable rate. On October 14, 1943, a date known as Black Thursday in Air Force history, the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17 bombers during a single raid on Schweinfurt, representing 600 men killed, wounded, or captured in one afternoon. The loss rate for bomber crews had reached 25%, meaning that a crewman's statistical probability of surviving a 25-mission tour was effectively zero. The bombers needed escorts, needed them desperately, and they needed escorts who could do something that had proven extraordinarily difficult: stay with the bombers all the way to the target and all the way back, rather than breaking off to chase personal glory in the form of enemy kills. Enter the 332nd Fighter Group. When they arrived in Italy in early 1944, flying P-47 Thunderbolts that would later be replaced with P-51 Mustangs, they brought with them not just their exceptional training, but a doctrine that would become legendary. They would never abandon the bombers. While other fighter groups measured success by individual kill counts, the Red Tails measured it by a different metric: bombers protected. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr., now commanding the group, issued orders that were unambiguous. The mission is the bombers, not personal glory. Any pilot who abandoned his assigned bomber box to chase enemy fighters would face court-martial. The Germans, accustomed to Allied fighters that could be lured away from their charges with the temptation of a dogfight, were about to discover what happened when they faced escorts who simply refused to take the bait. The statistics began accumulating with the mechanical inevitability of an assembly line. On June 9, 1944, the 332nd flew its first bomber escort mission to Munich. 0 bombers lost. On June 25, an escort to Bleshemer. 0 bombers lost. July 12, escort to southern France. 0 bombers lost. July 15, July 18, July 20. 000. The bomber crews began requesting the Red Tails specifically, asking by name for the fighters with the crimson markings. In the officers' clubs at bomber bases across Italy, the word spread, "If you see Red Tails, you're coming home." A myth began to circulate, one that the Red Tails themselves would later gently correct, that they had never lost a bomber. The truth was almost as remarkable. In over 200 bomber escort missions, the 332nd lost a total of 27 bombers to enemy action, a loss rate of 0.6%, compared to an average of 7% for other fighter groups. This wasn't just better performance. This was performance that existed in a different statistical universe, an outlier so extreme that it demanded explanation. The explanation lay in the intersection of 3 factors: superior initial training, absolute motivation, and disciplined tactical doctrine. While German pilots could often lure other American fighter groups into energy-wasting dogfights, the Red Tails simply wouldn't engage unless the threat was immediate and direct. They flew in tight, mutually supporting formations, with one element always maintaining altitude advantage, while another stayed with the bombers. They conserved their ammunition, refusing to spray and pray, and instead closed to optimal firing range, the killing zone between 200 and 400 meters, where their 50 caliber machine guns could do devastating work. They communicated constantly via radio, calling out threats and coordinating responses with a precision that reflected both their training and their unity of purpose. And they almost never ran out of fuel pursuing a fleeing enemy, because they had calculated their fuel consumption down to the minute and refused to deviate from their flight plans. On January 27, 1945, the mechanics of this system manifested in a single devastating mission that would crystallize everything the Red Tails represented. The target was Berlin itself, a 1,600-mile round trip that represented the extreme limit of fighter escort range, even for the long-legged P-51 Mustang. 64 Red Tail P-51 seconds took off from Ramitelli, Italy, at 0715 hours, each aircraft loaded with 419 gallons of fuel, 184 inches the internal tanks, 235 inches, 2 external drop tanks. They would rendezvous with the bombers over Austria and escort them all the way to Berlin and back, a 6-hour mission that would test endurance, navigation, and skill to their absolute limits. The Luftwaffe, recognizing the strategic importance of defending the capital, scrambled every available fighter Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds, Focke-Wulf FW 190 seconds, and even some of the new Me 262 jets. The German pilots, many of them veterans with dozens of kills, saw the Red Tails and assumed these would be the easy prey of the mission, the kills to pad their totals before engaging the more dangerous escorts. They were wrong with a finality that would be recorded in gun camera footage and loss reports. At 1,145 hours, approximately 80 miles southwest of Berlin, the German fighters attacked. What happened next lasted 12 minutes and resulted in one of the most lopsided aerial engagements of the war. The Red Tails, flying in a defensive weave pattern that kept them always within supporting distance of each other and the bombers, systematically dismantled the German attack. Captain Roscoe Brown, leading the 100th Fighter Squadron, spotted 3 Messerschmitt Me 262 jets diving toward the bomber formation at over 500 miles per hour, a speed advantage that should have made them nearly invulnerable. Brown did something that testified to both his skill and his aircraft knowledge. Rather than trying to match their speed, he calculated their intercept vector and positioned himself not where the jets were, but where they would have to be to make their attack run. At 1,147 hours, as the lead Me-262 pulled up from its bombing pass, Brown was waiting. His 6.50 caliber machine guns, firing at a combined rate of 4,800 rounds per minute, converged on the jet for exactly 2.3 seconds. The Me-262, hit by approximately 180 rounds, disintegrated in a ball of fire and aluminum fragments. Brown would later say, "It wasn't about being faster. It was about thinking 3 moves ahead, like chess." While Brown was engaging the jets, Lieutenant Charles Brantley of the 99th Fighter Squadron found himself in a turning fight with a Focke-Wulf 4-190, an aircraft considered by many to be the finest piston-engine fighter Germany produced. The FW-190 pilot, confident in his machine's roll rate and his own experience, attempted a scissors maneuver, a series of alternating turns designed to force an opponent to overshoot. Brantley didn't overshoot. His 320 hours of Tuskegee training had included 40 hours dedicated exclusively to deflection shooting and maneuvering combat, hour after hour of practice, until the calculations became instinctive. He stayed with the FW-190 through 4 reversals, each turn tighter than the last, each maneuver bleeding more energy from both aircraft, until they were both barely above stall speed, their wings shuddering on the edge of aerodynamic failure. On the 5th reversal, Brantley's P-51 snapped onto the FW-190's tail with mechanical precision. He fired a 2-second burst from 250 meters. The FW-190's engine exploded, and the German pilot bailed out at 400 feet, his parachute barely having time to deploy before he hit the ground. Across the engagement zone, the pattern repeated with variations, but the same ultimate outcome. Lieutenant Clarence Lester shot down 3 Bf-109 seconds in 4 minutes, his gun camera recording each kill with dispassionate precision. At 1,148 hours, 1 Bf-109 destroyed with a high deflection shot that required calculating lead angle, target speed, and bullet drop in the fraction of a second before pulling the trigger. At 1,150 hours, another Bf-109 caught in a climbing turn and hammered into wreckage by a perfectly placed burst. At 1,152 hours, a third Bf-109 that made the fatal mistake of trying to dive away, only to discover that Lester's P-51 could dive faster, and his own training had included specific instruction on maintaining control at high speed. Lieutenant Earl Lane shot down 2 aircraft. Lieutenant Walter Palmer shot down 1. Captain Edward Toppins shot down 2 more. The names accumulated with the kills, each representing hundreds of hours of training, each representing an individual who had overcome obstacles that would have stopped lesser men, each representing the proof that excellence could not be determined by skin color, but only by dedication, skill, and will. When the engagement ended at 1,157 hours, the mathematics were devastating. The 332nd Fighter Group had shot down 12 German aircraft, 3 Me-262 jets, and 9 piston-engine fighters, without losing a single bomber, and without losing a single one of their own aircraft. The German formation, which had begun the battle with numerical superiority and tactical initiative, retreated in disorder, leaving behind 12 debris fields marked by 12 funeral pyres of smoke. The bomber crews, who had watched the entire engagement from their stations, reported seeing the red-tailed fighters moving like they were choreographed, always in the right position, never out of place. One B-17 radio operator, monitoring the combat frequency, recalled hearing the red-tail pilots' communications. Calm, professional, like they were running a training exercise rather than fighting for their lives. They knew exactly what they were doing, and the Germans had no answer. But the January 27th mission was neither the beginning nor the end of the Red Tails' systematic dismantling of German air superiority. The numbers stretched across months, accumulating with the weight of evidence in a court case. Between June 1944 and April 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group flew 311 missions, 15,533 total sorties by individual pilots. They engaged enemy aircraft on 179 of those missions. The kill board, meticulously maintained on a wooden panel at Ramitelli Airfield, told a story that became impossible to dismiss as luck or anomaly. By March 1945, the board showed 111 confirmed aerial victories. By April 1945, it showed 112. The final tally, confirmed by gun camera footage and witness reports, and German loss records cross-referenced after the war, stood at 112 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, with another 150 destroyed on the ground during strafing missions. To understand the weight of these numbers, they must be placed in context. The average fighter group in the Mediterranean theater recorded approximately 75 to 80 air-to-air kills during the same period. The Red Tails exceeded this by 40%, while simultaneously maintaining the lowest bomber loss rate in the theater. They achieved these numbers while flying, on average, longer missions than other groups. The bomber escort role required them to stay airborne for 5 to 6 hours at a stretch, compared to 3 to 4 hours for groups flying primarily fighter sweeps. They achieved these numbers despite starting their combat operations 8 months later than many other groups, giving them less time to accumulate victories. They achieved these numbers while facing not just the Luftwaffe, but also the institutional resistance of their own military, which persisted in assigning them less glamorous missions and obsolete aircraft for months before finally equipping them with first-line P-51 Mustangs in July 1944. The individual aces of the 332nd testified to both the group's collective excellence and the exceptional peaks it produced. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the commanding officer, shot down 4 enemy aircraft, despite spending most of his time on command duties rather than active combat, flying a testament to the quality of training that could produce such results, even in someone whose primary focus was leadership. Captain Lee Archer, flying from June 1944 through the war's end, recorded 4 confirmed kills and 4 probable kills, numbers that would have been higher if the strict confirmation standards hadn't been applied. Archer's gun camera footage showed at least 6 additional German aircraft smoking and losing altitude, but without either the aircraft crashing or the pilot bailing out in view of a witness, they couldn't be confirmed. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Ellsbury recorded 3 confirmed kills in a single mission on July 12, 1944, during an engagement over southern France, where his element of 4 P-51 seconds destroyed 7 German fighters without loss. But perhaps the most revealing statistics were those that measured not kills but survival and effectiveness. The 332nd Fighter Group lost a total of 66 pilots killed in action during their combat operations, from June 1944 to April 1945, a loss rate of 6.3% compared to an average of 11% for other fighter groups. This wasn't because they faced less dangerous missions. Bomber escort duty was among the most hazardous assignments in the Army Air Forces, requiring fighters to maintain predictable patterns and remain with slow-moving, vulnerable bombers rather than exploit their speed and maneuverability. The lower loss rate reflected superior training, superior discipline, and superior mutual support. Red Tail pilots looked after each other with an intensity born from the knowledge that they were more than just squadron mates. They were proving a proposition that extended beyond themselves. In a diary entry from August 1944, Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson wrote, "We don't just cover the bombers, we cover each other. Jimmy stayed with me today when my engine was running rough, forgoing a kill opportunity to make sure I made it home. Tomorrow I'll do the same for him. The Germans fight for Germany. We fight for each other. And for everyone who looks like us, who'll never get the chance to sit in this cockpit." The response from the bomber crews was unequivocal and documented in hundreds of after-action reports. On August 24, 1944, the commander of the 5th Bombardment Wing issued a formal commendation. The 332nd Fighter Group has demonstrated exceptional aerial combat capability and unwavering dedication to bomber protection. Our crews have expressed overwhelming confidence in the Red Tails, and their performance has resulted in measurably lower loss rates when under their escort. Individual crews were more direct. A B-17 pilot named Captain Robert Williams wrote to the 332nd, "You saved our asses over Munich. We counted 16 fighters coming at us, and you guys intercepted every single one. I don't care what color you are. I care that you're goddamn good at your jobs." Another bomber pilot, in a letter to Stars and Stripes, put it simply, "They're the best fighter group in the theater, and anyone who says different is either ignorant or a bigot." The German perspective, documented in captured documents and post-war interviews, revealed the psychological impact of encountering the Red Tails. A Luftwaffe intelligence report from February 1945, discovered in captured files after the war, noted, "The American Neger Jagdgruppe, Negro Fighter Group, with the red tail markings has proven to be exceptionally disciplined and skilled. They do not respond to standard baiting tactics and maintain formation integrity under circumstances where other American units become scattered. Pilots should be advised to approach these escorts with the same caution recommended for engaging elite British squadrons." This was a remarkable assessment coming from an air force that had been indoctrinated with Nazi racial theories positioning black individuals as subhuman. The report didn't emerge from humanitarian enlightenment, it emerged from self-preservation. German pilots who had encountered the Red Tails and survived learned quickly that their preconceptions were not just wrong but actively dangerous. A Luftwaffe pilot named Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, interviewed in 1991 as part of an oral history project, provided a personal account that crystallized this realization. Stigler, who survived the war with 28 confirmed kills, described an engagement from March 1945. "We were briefed that we would be engaging American bombers escorted by various fighter units. When we identified the escorts by their red tails, several of the younger pilots made jokes, repeating the propaganda about inferior American pilots. I told them to shut up. I had encountered these men before, and they were no joke. They flew like they had invented the aircraft. Their formations were perfect. They didn't make mistakes. On that mission, we lost 4 fighters and didn't even get close to the bombers. After we landed, one of the young pilots who had been joking was dead. He had underestimated them. That was his last mistake." The tactical evolution that occurred as German pilots learned to respect the Red Tails became evident in Luftwaffe orders. In January 1945, German pilots were ordered to engage any American fighter formations identified by tail markings. By March 1945, updated orders specified that formations with red tail markings should only be engaged if the German force had a numerical superiority of at least 3-1 and altitude advantage. This was an extraordinary tactical concession, elevating the Red Tails to a threat level usually reserved for the most elite Allied units. The Luftwaffe had effectively admitted, in operational orders, that the Tuskegee Airmen were too dangerous to engage on even terms. The ground crews of the 332nd, an integrated unit that included both black mechanics who had followed the pilots through training and white crew chiefs who had been assigned to the group, told their own story of excellence. Master Sergeant Samuel Jefferson, a crew chief responsible for maintaining 6P-51 seconds, recorded in a letter home, "These aircraft fly more hours per month than any other fighters in Italy, 240, 2 hours per aircraft on average in March, compared to 190 for other groups. And our mechanical reliability rate is 97%. We keep them flying because we know what's at stake. Every mission these pilots fly isn't just about winning the war. It's about proving something that shouldn't need proving. So we make sure every rivet is tight, every system is perfect, every gun is aligned to the millimeter. We don't get to fly, but we send them up knowing that any mechanical failure will be blamed on the pilot's race rather than our maintenance. So we don't allow mechanical failures." The armament statistics supported this narrative of absolute precision. The 332nd Fighter Group maintained an ammunition expenditure rate of 42 rounds per kill, meaning they destroyed an enemy aircraft, on average, with less than 1 second of sustained fire. Compare this to the theater average of 310 rounds per kill, and the picture becomes clear. The Red Tails weren't spray and pray fighters. They were surgical marksmen who closed to optimal range, calculated the geometry of deflection shooting with computer-like precision, and fired only when a kill was probable. This efficiency reflected their training, which had included far more gunnery practice than standard programs, and their motivation which made every round of ammunition feel precious because every mission felt like it carried the weight of history. The awards and decorations accumulated like evidence in an overwhelming case. The 332nd Fighter Group received 3 Distinguished Unit citations, the organizational equivalent of the Medal of Honor, awarded only for extraordinary heroism against an armed enemy. Individual pilots received 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 14 Bronze Stars, and 744 Air Medals. 3 pilots received the Legion of Merit. These weren't participation trophies. They were recognition of combat achievement that exceeded the normal bounds of duty. When the war ended in May 1945, the 332nd had more decorations per pilot than any other fighter group in the Mediterranean theater. The numbers, once again, told a story that transcended individual anecdote and entered the realm of statistical proof. But the most profound impact of the Tuskegee Airmen wasn't measured in kills or decorations or even in bomber protection rates. It was measured in what their existence forced the military and the nation to confront. On July 26, 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, mandating the desegregation of the United States Armed Forces. The order's preamble didn't mention the Tuskegee Airmen by name, but their influence was undeniable. The military's own data had proven that black service members, when given equal training and opportunity, performed at least as well as whites, and often better. The experiment designed to document failure had instead documented excellence. The policy built on racial prejudice had been demolished by competence, so overwhelming that it could not be explained away or dismissed. Generals who had insisted that integration would destroy unit cohesion were confronted with the 332nd Fighter Group, a unit whose cohesion was so strong that it produced operational results other units couldn't match. Senators who had argued that black pilots lacked the intelligence for complex aircraft were confronted with kill ratios and mission success rates that made their claims look not just wrong but absurd. The Red Tails' victory was thus dual. They won in the air against the Luftwaffe, and they won on the ground against institutional racism. The first victory was measured in bullet holes and burning wreckage. The second was measured in changed policies and opened opportunities. Both victories were built on the same foundation: training so rigorous that it produced excellence, motivation so intense that it refused to accept defeat, and results so overwhelming that they couldn't be dismissed or explained away. When Klaus Fischer dove on that formation of Red Tails on March 24, 1945, he was encountering not just pilots but the culmination of a historical process. He was encountering men who had been told they couldn't fly and had responded by becoming the best flyers in the theater. He was encountering men who had been given obsolete equipment and had responded by extracting maximum performance from every aircraft. He was encountering men who had been assigned to fail and had responded by succeeding with such decisiveness that they changed the course of American history. Fischer survived that engagement, one of the lucky ones. His Bf-109 took hits in the engine and wing, but he managed to nurse it back to his base near Dresden, landing gear up on the grass beside a cratered runway. In his post-flight report, filed that evening and discovered in Luftwaffe archives after the war, he wrote, "The Negro pilots fought with exceptional skill and determination. Previous intelligence suggesting inferior training or capability appears to be completely inaccurate. Recommend that all personnel be briefed that these units represent a serious threat and should be approached with the same caution as elite enemy formations." This was a remarkable statement from a man who had been raised in Nazi Germany, trained in an air force built on theories of racial superiority, and who had begun the day with contempt for his opponents. His opinion had been changed not by moral persuasion or political argument, but by the simple mathematics of combat. The Red Tails shot down German aircraft at rates that demanded respect, and respect, earned in air combat, is the most genuine form of respect that exists. It cannot be faked, cannot be awarded through bureaucratic decision, cannot be granted through social pressure. It must be taken, seized through performance so excellent that it compels acknowledgement even from those who wish to deny it. The bomber crews knew this truth. On missions where the escort roster showed the 332nd Fighter Group assigned, Sick call rates dropped to near zero. Pilots who had legitimate medical reasons to stand down from a mission would dose themselves with painkillers or ignore minor injuries because they knew that flying under red tail protection dramatically increased their survival odds. A B-24 pilot named Lieutenant Robert Delaney, who flew 31 missions with various escorts, stated in a 1989 interview, "You could feel the difference when the red tails showed up. Other escorts would take off after German fighters, chasing them to get kills, and we'd be left vulnerable. The red tails stayed glued to us. I watched them pass up what looked like easy kills, because taking the shot would have meant leaving their assigned position. They cared more about bringing us home than about their personal scores. That's why we trusted them with our lives, and that's why most of us made it home." The trust extended beyond mere professional respect. In an era where segregation was enforced by law in much of America, where black service members were routinely treated as second-class soldiers, the bomber crews of the 15th Air Force began actively requesting the red tails and writing letters to commanders praising their performance. This grassroots endorsement from white pilots and crew members who had experienced the red tails' protection in combat provided a counterweight to the institutional racism that still pervaded the military. When generals in Washington received reports from bomber crews saying, "We don't care what color they are, we want them protecting us," it became increasingly difficult to maintain that segregation was necessary for unit effectiveness. The missions continued through the spring of 1945 with the same relentless excellence. On March 31st, the 332nd escorted bombers to Hamburg, engaging 40 German fighters and shooting down 7 without loss to either themselves or the bombers. On April 1st, an escort to Berlin resulted in 4 more kills. On April 16th, 3 kills during an engagement over Linz. The tally accumulated with the steady rhythm of an assembly line, each kill representing another statistical proof point, another piece of evidence that the Tuskegee experiment had produced exactly the opposite of what its skeptical architects had expected. The logbook of the 332nd Fighter Group, maintained in precise handwriting by the group operations officer, recorded sortie after sortie, mission after mission, each entry a small piece of a larger mosaic that, when viewed from sufficient distance, revealed a picture of sustained excellence that few military units in any air force have ever matched. The final missions of the war, flown in April 1945 as Germany collapsed, had a different character than the desperate combats of earlier months. The Luftwaffe had been ground down by attrition, by fuel shortages, by the loss of experienced pilots who couldn't be replaced. Many missions involved no air-to-air combat at all, the red tails flying escort through empty skies where once there had been swarms of German fighters. But even in these final weeks, the 332nd maintained their discipline and their standards. They flew their patterns perfectly. They stayed with their bombers. They remained vigilant for the possibility of attack, even when attack had become unlikely. Because they understood, perhaps more clearly than any other unit in the Army Air Forces, that their performance wasn't just about this war. It was about the next war, and the one after that, and the peacetime that would follow. It was about whether future generations of Black Americans would have the opportunity to serve as pilots, as officers, as full participants in their nation's defense. It was about whether excellence could overcome prejudice, whether performance could demolish institutional barriers, whether demonstrated capability could force recognition from those who had spent decades denying that capability could exist. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, the final statistics of the 332nd Fighter Group stood as testimony to what had been achieved. In 11 months of combat operations, 15,533 sorties flown, 311 missions completed, 179 combat engagements with enemy aircraft, 112 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, 150 aircraft destroyed on the ground, 950 railcars, trucks, and other ground vehicles destroyed during strafing runs. 0 bombers lost to enemy fighters on missions where the Red Tails provided penetration escort all the way to and from the target. 66 pilots killed in action. 32 pilots captured as prisoners of war. The unit awarded 3 Distinguished Unit citations. Individual pilots awarded 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses. These numbers, cold, and precise, documented an organizational success story that had implications extending far beyond the narrow confines of military aviation. The German pilots who had mocked the Tuskegee Airmen, who had called them servants, who had assumed they would be easy victories, had learned through bitter experience what excellence looked like when it emerged from adversity. In the post-war period, interviews with Luftwaffe survivors revealed a consistent theme. The Red Tails had earned a reputation among German pilots as some of the most dangerous opponents in the sky. A Luftwaffe report from March 1945, intended for internal circulation among German fighter units, characterized the 332nd as extremely dangerous, highly trained, exceptional discipline, avoid engagement unless conditions are favorable. This assessment, coming from pilots who had faced the best of the RAF and the Soviet Air Force, represented an acknowledgement that skill and determination mattered more than the color of a pilot's skin. The psychological weight of the Red Tails' success extended beyond mere military effectiveness. They had proven, in the most unforgiving arena possible, that Black Americans were capable of mastering the most technologically complex and demanding task in modern warfare: fighter aviation. They had done so while facing obstacles that would have destroyed lesser men: discrimination, low expectations, inadequate equipment initially, missions designed to be less glamorous than those assigned to white units. They had responded to these obstacles not with bitterness or resignation, but with a level of excellence so high that it couldn't be ignored or explained away. They had transformed every disadvantage into motivation, every barrier into fuel, every dismissive comment into determination. And they had documented their success with the cold precision of gun camera footage, mission reports, and kill confirmations that couldn't be dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. The legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen extended forward through time, with the same relentless force that had characterized their combat operations. The men who flew as Red Tails would go on to distinguished careers. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. became the first black general in the United States Air Force. Daniel Chappie James Jr., who flew with the Red Tails late in the war, became the first black four-star general. Lee Archer became a successful businessman and civil rights advocate. Charles McGee flew 409 combat missions across 3 wars, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, and lived to see his promotion to brigadier general at age 97. But more important than these individual success stories was the institutional change they forced into being. The military, confronted with undeniable evidence that segregation produced inferior results and that black service members could excel at the highest levels, had no choice but to evolve. Executive Order 9981 didn't emerge from abstract moral reasoning. It emerged from the practical realization, driven by the Red Tails' performance data, that racial discrimination made the military less effective. The bomber crews who had flown under Red Tail protection carried their experiences back to civilian life, becoming advocates for civil rights, because they had seen firsthand what black Americans could achieve when given opportunity. A B-17 pilot named Captain James Mitchell, who had flown 15 missions escorted by the 332nd, later became a judge in Ohio and consistently ruled against segregation ordinances. In his memoirs, he wrote, "I watched those men save my life. I watched them pass up personal glory to fulfill their mission. I watched them perform with a level of excellence that made me question everything I'd been taught about racial inferiority. When I returned home and saw whites-only signs, I thought about the Red Tails and realized those signs weren't about capability or merit. They were about fear and prejudice. I decided I would spend the rest of my career dismantling that prejudice wherever I found it, because I had seen the alternative. This multiplication effect, combat veterans becoming advocates, advocates becoming policymakers, policy changes creating new opportunities represented the Red Tails' ultimate victory. They hadn't just won battles, they had changed the battlefield. They hadn't just defeated enemy pilots, they had defeated the institutional assumption that some Americans were inherently inferior to others. They had done so not through political activism or moral persuasion, though those had their place, but through the simple, devastating method of being so good at their jobs that no one could deny their excellence. In a world where debate can continue indefinitely, where statistics can be questioned, and motivations can be impugned, the Red Tails provided an answer that couldn't be disputed. They flew the missions, protected the bombers, shot down the enemy, and came home. Everything else was commentary. The mathematics of their achievement, viewed from the perspective of decades, reveal the true scale of what they accomplished. They took a program designed to fail, survived selection criteria, intentionally made punishing, excelled in training that lasted longer and demanded more than standard programs, deployed to combat with inadequate equipment, faced both enemy fighters and institutional discrimination, and responded by producing combat results that exceeded every comparison unit. They did this while maintaining lower loss rates, higher mission success rates, better bomber protection statistics, and more decorations per pilot than groups that began with every advantage. The statistical improbability of this achievement, absent the explanation of exceptional quality in both personnel and training, approaches zero. They weren't lucky. They weren't average pilots who happened to have good missions. They were exceptional pilots who made their own luck through preparation, discipline, and mutual support, so strong that it became their primary tactical advantage. When we speak of the Tuskegee Airmen, we often focus on the inspirational narrative, men overcoming racism to achieve excellence. This is true and important, but it risks missing the deeper lesson. The Red Tails didn't just overcome racism, they obliterated it, with empirical evidence so overwhelming that even racists were forced to acknowledge their capability. They transformed what was meant to be a demonstration of inferiority into a proof of superiority. They took every disadvantage and converted it into an advantage. They were given inadequate resources and extracted maximum performance. They faced low expectations and responded with achievements that exceeded high expectations. They were dismissed, mocked, and underestimated, and they responded by becoming the most feared fighter group in the Mediterranean theater, feared not because they were cruel or reckless, but because they were devastatingly effective. The German pilot who mocked them paid with his aircraft and his confidence. The institutional racism that tried to prevent them from flying paid with its credibility and its legal backing. The bomber crews who flew with them paid them back with trust, advocacy, and friendship that crossed racial lines in an era when such friendships were still controversial. The nation they served paid them back, decades late, with recognition, honors, and the Congressional Gold Medal awarded collectively to all Tuskegee Airmen in 2007. But the real payment, the compensation that mattered most, was simpler and more profound. They proved what they had known all along, but had been denied the chance to demonstrate. They proved they could fly. They proved they could fight. They proved they could win. They proved they could excel. They proved that excellence is colorblind, that capability cannot be determined by complexion, that performance is the only valid measure of worth. In the end, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen is the story of how empirical evidence defeats prejudice, how performance demolishes assumptions, how excellence forces recognition, even from those most committed to denying it. It's a story written in mission reports and kill confirmations, in bomber crew testimonials, and Luftwaffe intelligence assessments, in award citations and survival statistics. It's a story that could only be written in the unforgiving medium of combat, where there are no participation trophies, no credit for good intentions, no excuses for failure. Either you protect the bombers, or you don't. Either you shoot down enemy aircraft, or you don't. Either you bring your pilots home, or you don't. Either you succeed, or you fail. And the Red Tails succeeded with a completeness that transformed military policy, advanced civil rights, and proved that what Americans can achieve is determined not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their training, the strength of their motivation, and the excellence of their performance. This was their victory, and it was absolute.